Good evening and welcome to tonight's program. The Lincoln Presidential Foundation is proud to have recently launched our Fortifying Our Democracy Lincoln's Lyceum Address. This project, made possible with generous support from Iron Mountain, explores the events that led Abraham Lincoln to deliver his speech, the perpetuation of our political institutions, to the Young Men's Lyceum in 1838, and the lessons that we can take from it today. The project includes an array of new resources available on our website, including a companion docuseries. In just a moment, we will be premiering the first two segments of the docuseries, The Danger of Mob Violence and The Problem of Decaying Trust, followed by a discussion led by our president and CEO, Erin Carlson Mast, and featuring Dr. Kate Major and Dr. Saladin Ambar. My name is Phyllis Evans, and I'm the Senior Director of Development for the Foundation. Before we begin our program this evening, I'd just like to thank each of you for joining us and reminding you that following tonight's program, we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the question to as many as we possibly can. And now, the premiere of segments 1 and 2 of Fortifying Our Democracy, Lincoln's Lyceum Address.
Abraham Lincoln was a self-educated lawyer. He was extremely ambitious. He was very well-read. He had educated himself. He came from humble beginnings. But what's remarkable about Lincoln is how thoughtful he is from a very young age.
He moves from New Salem to Springfield, which becomes the capital of Illinois in 1837. Ultimately, he becomes an attorney and a state official, and that is the beginnings of his early political career right there in Springfield.
Lincoln was invited to speak before a group that was called the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield. These young men tended to debate questions that had to do with state and regional and national political issues. The word lyceum is from the Greek. It was the name of Aristotle's school.
A lyceum is what we would call today a public lecture or an educational institution.
Lyceums today might be something akin to your local library hosting guest speakers.
These organizations were seen to be fun. You could do well, you could do not so well.
Lyceums were forums for the expression of democratic values and the virtues of what it means to be an American, how to be a good American, how to be a good person. And so the topics of the day were discussed there in a public setting.
So Lincoln is invited to give this speech at the Lyceum. And for his topic, he chooses the perpetuation of our political institutions. He does that because he sees American democracy under attack because of the rise of mob violence over the issue of slavery.
Lincoln, in his Lyceum address, mentions 3 series of murders, the first of which occur in 1835. There had been a pamphlet circulated suggesting that there was going to be a slave insurrection throughout the state of Mississippi. And white gamblers at the time had long been vilified and disdained for their craft. The fears stirred by this would-be fanciful insurrection were directed towards them because these white gamblers were somehow responsible for helping and aiding and abetting this prospective black insurrection in Mississippi. Well, that wasn't true, but they were linked to it.
So many people were hanged. Black people, white people, they just hanged them without any due process of law for being suspected slave rebels or assisting slave rebellion. Lincoln says they've left them hanging on the trees of Mississippi like the Spanish moss.
And then we have the killing of the white abolitionist Elijah Lovejoy, who wrote very vehemently and increasingly so against slavery, but also condemned in harsh language the burning of Francis McIntosh, a free black man in St. Louis. Lovejoy was forced to leave St. Louis and set up his print shop in Alton, Illinois, southern part of Illinois, a free state. Nevertheless, he was tracked down and months later killed there in his printing press, famously thrown into the river. Each of these events Lincoln highlights, and I think importantly, links them together as part of this abandonment of what Washington and others hoped for in this country, which is if someone is guilty, there's a process. We go through a judicial process. We don't just string people up on trees or shoot them or burn them.
He goes on to explain why recourse to the rule of law and to the courts is the thing that can hold Americans together amid all of these disagreements and differences, that's all we have.
And Lincoln is not pro-slavery by any stretch of the imagination. He is definitely anti-slavery in sentiment. You can see that right from the start of his political career in the resolutions of the Illinois legislature of 1837 against abolitionists that he protests against. That's taking a political risk. Abolitionists are not popular. They're being attacked by people who are part of the status quo.
Lincoln saw this as the giving up to the passions rather than reason. Sober reason must be our salvation. Otherwise, we're going to fall prey to these passions that will lead the nation to commit what he calls suicide.
It is certainly the case that features of the subject matter in 1837 resonate throughout American history. There are many moments of extreme violence. There are many moments of racially motivated violence. There are moments of mob violence. There are worries and concerns about the longevity of our democracy, the health of our democracy. Those themes and topics recur. So looking at the way Lincoln and others of his time were grappling with these questions, it can help us think through our own present moment. One of the things that Lyceum activity did encourage was thoughtful reflection, debate, listening to others. There are features of this text that I think can help us think through for ourselves how we want to live our own lives.
Francis McIntosh was a black man from Pittsburgh who was visiting St. Louis, and he comes off of the ship and finds himself in a melee with local police who are trying to chase down a suspect, and they enlist McIntosh into this chase, and when he refuses, they arrest him. And such begins the sad and tragic tale of McIntosh, who, before he is incarcerated, strikes a blow to one of the officers, a deadly blow, kills a police officer, and before long, a mob surrounds his jail cell, and they remove him forcibly, take him to the outskirts of what was St. Louis at the time, where he is chained to a tree and burned alive.
And they got away with it because when they were put on trial, a judge suitably named Judge Lawless, he actually let the mob go free.
William Herndon argues that this moment where McIntosh is killed spurs Lincoln to action to talk about the rule of law and democratic decline in Springfield that night in January of 1838.
Lincoln is saying everyone is entitled to due process of law, and it's corrosive for our whole community and for the whole country if we succumb to our passions in this way.
Francis McIntosh is the only person Abraham Lincoln mentions by name who is a victim. He mentions several other people. He concludes the address by talking about George Washington. He mentions Alexander and Julius Caesar and Napoleon. But of the victims, including the white victim Elijah Lovejoy, who wrote about McIntosh's murder, McIntosh is the only one Lincoln mentions by name. I think this is important. In historic context, even today, after any number of deaths related to police brutality, we still find ourselves as a nation glossing over the names of black victims. For Lincoln to mention McIntosh by name is critical. It not only humanizes him, But it also suggests that this particular killing, racially motivated and based as it was, is an important element to this overall discussion of democratic decline. It's not just that the rule of law is being abandoned in a vacuum. It's connected to our history and present history at the time related to race. And Lincoln makes that connection, one that, incidentally, no other politician is making. And that makes the speech particularly impressive, but also unique.
One of the things that was characteristic of this period was that the participants in the mobs and people who defended them were often very respectable members of the community. They were members of the elite who would say, well, we just had to do this because we had to run those bad guys out of town, or the abolitionists are divisive, the abolitionists are a threat to our community, and so we have to violently push them out of town, make an example of them to preserve the peace of our community. And so many of these mob actions were done in the name of the public good or the public peace. One of the things Lincoln is saying is, it is never okay to participate in a mob or justify a mob. No matter how much you don't like what some person is doing, we should never resort to allowing our passions to overtake reason. And we have institutions that are designed to deal with conflict, and we need to use them. And if we don't, we are on the road to ruin.
At the very beginning of the Lyceum Address, Lincoln describes the gifts of American democracy and that these gifts were bequeathed to us by the founders. The field has already been harvested. That's the language he uses in terms of glory. They set out this beautiful experiment in self-government. Our job is to fulfill it by carrying it out. And that's where we come into the dangers lurking that Lincoln sees as threatening the possibility of this democratic experiment continuing. It's not going to come from abroad, he said, but it's going to come from ourselves. We must live together as free men or die by suicide, he says. No foreign government is the threat. The threat is our own ability to use reason and common sense to soberly walk the path of democratic due process and justice.
With increased lawlessness, people's sense of adherence to the government, their faith in the government will be diminished. If the government can't protect me, then my own commitments to it diminish. He saw that as a real risk with the kinds of lawlessness that he saw across the nation.
What do you do when there are laws that you think are wrong or laws that you disagree with? He says in the Lyceum Address, you get them repealed, right? The answer is not to break those laws, it's to get them repealed.
Lincoln believed that since the founders have died off, we don't have the muscle memory for democracy the way we used to. This comes down to feelings. How do we get those feelings to the proper level? Education. Democracy has to be ritualized. It has to be cared for and cultivated on an ongoing basis. And I think this is what Lincoln is getting at. You know, it's not, well, the founders established it and we're good. No, each generation is charged with caretaking American democracy.
One way that I think ordinary American citizens can help shore up our democracy and uphold our representative government is to understand that American citizens are all in this together, that upholding the republic is not a partisan thing, that upholding the republic means recognizing the humanity of each other. So I think it's really important right now not to pour fuel into the fire and to constantly rile up people, which seems to be our present political mode, unfortunately. But I think that does pose a danger to the republic in the long run, because if you're going to demonize your enemy to that degree, in the end, you won't see them as fellow citizens. You will see them as the enemy, that you would wish, as Lincoln wants, a foreign power to triumph over your internal enemy. That's the only way a republic dies, as he says, through suicide. I think that is one thing that we can certainly learn from Lincoln's Lyceum Address, but one thing that we should think about more deeply and thoughtfully as he did.
And thank you all again for joining us for the first in a special two-part Fourscore Speaker Series program featuring experts from our newest documentary series, Fortifying Our Democracy, Lincoln's Lyceum Address. We're grateful to Iron Mountain for their generous support that made the project possible. This week is also National Civic Learning Week, and I've lost count how many times folks in civic education have told me that they consider Lincoln's speech to the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield in 1838 an essential case for the importance of civic learning, if not a prophetic one. And you heard that sentiment expressed in the clips we saw tonight too. It's also been reported that this year will be, quote, a record-breaking year for elections with more than 2 billion people anticipated to vote in 50 countries, including the United States, the European Union, and India, which is considered the world's largest democracy. At the same time, concerns have been raised about democracy being in decline globally, and various indices exist that catalog what we know from the historical record to be true, which is that democracy can be established and strengthened as much as it can be weakened and destroyed. And it's incumbent upon all of us as citizens to ensure the former, not the latter. We have a lot to explore tonight, and we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Saladin Ambar and Dr. Kate Masur to help us do just that. Dr. Ambar is a professor of political science and senior scholar at Rutgers University's Eagleton Institute of Politics Center on the American Governor. His most recent book is Stars and Shadows, The Politics of Interracial Friendship from Jefferson to Obama. He's also a four-time author and expert commentator on CNN's series, Race for the White House. Dr. Masur is a professor of history and Board of Visitors professor at Northwestern University and specializes in the history of race, politics, and law in the United States. Her most recent book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement, From the Revolution to Reconstruction, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History and winner of numerous American History Awards. Dean and Kate, welcome. I'd like us to start by digging a bit more into the context of Abraham Lincoln's speech. So first off, broadly speaking, there's a generational shift happening at this time. Lincoln's 28 when he makes this speech. It's in the 50th anniversary year of the ratification of the US Constitution. So for some context for listeners, his father, Thomas Lincoln, was alive before we had a constitutional republic. So he's of that generation that came after it established. Dean, what's the context for that generational shift that's happening in the nation at that time?
Well, Erin, first of all, let me just thank you again and reiterate my appreciation for what the Lincoln Presidential Foundation is doing and what you all stand for. The issue is that we are some generations removed from the founding. Alexis de Tocqueville visits the United States in 1831, and he lauds America's democracy. Yet there are signs of deterioration on the horizon. We have an Indian Removal Act. In that same year, we have a Trail of Tears. We have the expansion of slavery west. And as Lincoln notes in his Lyceum Address, scores of violence, namely mob violence, vigilantism occurring across the country. And these issues underscore the vulnerability of the nation's democracy despite reaching its 50th year.
Yeah. Kate, I appreciate you commenting on that as well. And also this idea that the American Revolution was that common national cause holding people together. What is now, especially in light of everything that Dean just referenced?
Exactly. And let me also just thank you again for having us here and for producing this really terrific film. So as Dean said, and here is Lincoln, born in 1809, father born well before the American Revolution, or during, and thinking about the generation of their fathers, and thinking about the ways that fighting together for the independence of the United States brought people together. He talks even in the Lyceum Address about how they had a common enemy in Great Britain. And then the idea that those ties could fray now that they're in the middle of what they considered to be a largely successful experiment in Republican self-government. But in this speech, he's almost saying we're almost too successful because we begin to take our success for granted and we're not doing enough to shore up our institutions. And he's really worried that in the generation that he's part of and in future generations, they won't have the same glue of the formation of a nation, the project of a formation of a new nation founded in the idea of self-government to kind of stick them together. And so it opens them up, he's saying, for a kind of vulnerability that people will, not all be part of the same project. And so he's concerned at this point about what that looks like.
Yeah. Well, and I think, just even in speaking, in being in the public history space, it can be easy for generations now so much further removed to forget or not know the context of how rare representative democracy was, even still in the 1830s, certainly at the founding of the United States, but still during that time. Still relatively rare globally. Dean, you referenced de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, published around that time, even though he visited earlier in the decade. And his official purpose was to look at the US prison system, but he does wind up exploring representative government and why it survived here when it hasn't elsewhere. We don't know, I think we still don't know whether Lincoln ever read Democracy in America, but even so, what context does that book provide that's useful for understanding Lincoln's speech? If you could go into that a little more, please.
Sure. Well, de Tocqueville's interested in civic engagement. The fact that Americans belong to associations he finds really important, that somehow we are engaged in our societies in ways that ennoble us and help us to become free. That's critical, and that our political participation, the formation of parties, has not ripped asunder our politics, but actually helped more people become engaged. So Tocqueville sees America as a nation of joiners, a nation of people who are collectively engaged and communal politically. In the Lyceum, Lincoln references a kind of novel term. He says, let this become the civil religion of the nation, referring to our appreciation and bonds with our democracy. That's powerful. So Tocqueville is seeing something happening here that is impressive, and Lincoln sees it as impressive also. He just happens to also be aware of the volatility associated with the period that is beginning to fray at the edges this edifice that the founders had built.
Well, and speaking of that fraying, Kate, you've written a lot about the political violence in Illinois. What can you tell us about the context of the lawlessness and the political violence in the region during this time period?
Yeah, I mean, in the context of our own moment, it's sort of, it's a little bit hard to imagine, but Illinois was actually a very volatile place in the period that we're talking about. And, we can begin with just the process of the white settlers moving into Illinois, the process of those white settlers pushing Native Americans out, whether through treaties, through violence, the Black Hawk War itself, which was kind of one of the most important conflicts that ended up pushing many Native Americans out of northern and northwestern Illinois. And so, you have, I was struck again this time reading the speech where he actually begins with a kind of praise for the land that we're on and talks about the bounty of the land and our rightful possession of it as the foundation of the order that he's talking about. And, when we think about it now, I mean, he's kind of taking for granted. I mean, he's certainly sort of taking for granted that it is, that it is, his right and their right to be on that land, and that the land is the source of their prosperity and creates the conditions in which they can create this self-governing republic, but the land was taken, right, through violence. And so then you also have, as was mentioned in the clips that we saw, we have rising threats of anti-abolitionist violence, which was present in Illinois. You have kind of mob violence against gamblers and just general mob violence against people who other people didn't like. You have in Illinois itself, the murder of Elijah Lovejoy after the murder of McIntosh in St. Louis. You have anti-Mormon violence. And so there's just a lot of both sanctioned and unsanctioned violence going on. And so in some ways, the milieu that Lincoln is in, it's like it's aspirationally peaceful and law abiding, but actually, I mean, not only the violence that he's talking about is anomalous in some ways, but it's less anomalous than you might think, because there's just so much kind of mob violence in many, as he says in the speech, in many different places in the United States, in the North, in the South, in the West, and kind of overall different kinds of issues. So it's a really volatile situation. And that's part of what he's actually talking about, right? Is how do we quell this? How do we begin to try to solve our differences without this in a more lawful way?
That's really helpful context, Kate. And Dean, in the film, you also referenced the fact that it was extremely unusual, if not unprecedented, that Lincoln names one of the Black victims, and that McIntosh is the only victim of one of these acts of mob violence that he names. Can you talk a little bit more about why that's so significant?
Well, sure. Let's go back to Washington's farewell address, where he says, with slight shades of difference, we have the same religion, habits, customs, traditions. In effect, we come from the same stock, Washington says, in his effort to create national unity. Well, Lincoln realizes that we're in a moment 50 years later where we all don't share the same religion. We all don't come from the same stock, if you will. And he references these three murders, these series of murders along the Mississippi, not in New England, not across the country, but really very geographically specific, and all of them involve slavery and racial injustice. So Lincoln early on is saying something that I think needs to be said today, quite frankly, that you just can't have a law and order kind of disposition or purely a racial justice disposition. These things need to be married. We need to have a country where the multitude, the plurality of who we are as a people comes together with safety and security, but also with racial justice, because the country cannot survive. As he says, it will be subjected to suicide if we operate under a different kind of ethos.
Yeah. Well, so I'd like to ask a little bit about how trust, you mentioned injustice, how trust in the systems and the institutions plays into this. Dr. Sinha talks about Judge Lawless and even makes the point that his last name is Lawless, letting people conducting this mob violence go. And Kate, in the film, you talk about how a lot of these people were so-called respectable people who were doing this in the name of keeping the peace, which sounds a lot like, vigilante oppression. So can you talk a little bit about how the courts themselves are conducting themselves during this time, feeding into this idea of a breakdown of trust?
It's a little bit unpredictable, right? So the courts, as you're suggesting, can't always be relied on to kind of put out real justice, right? And nor was there an expectation. For example, with the lynching of McIntosh, it is not surprising to us now that the people who participated in that mob were not prosecuted, not convicted. We wouldn't expect that white people who mobbed and murdered a Black man in Missouri at that time, it would be very surprising if they had been brought to justice. And so, Lincoln as a lawyer wants these systems to work better. In his ideal world, and I think he would actually have certainly acknowledged that the courts didn't always do justice as they should. In his ideal world, you would have people resolving their problems through the courts, through legislation, through changing laws that they didn't like, as opposed to just breaking those laws. You would have this kind of very orderly world where anybody, regardless of their status, could get justice in the courts. But he certainly well knew that that wasn't the case, right? And as a lawyer himself, I mean, he knew that more powerful people often prevailed, powerful for whatever reasons, even if that wasn't really fair. And so I think it's kind of like operating on two levels, where he's saying, I want people to have more faith in our political institutions. All we really have is our political and legal institutions, once the founding generation has died off. What we need to place our faith in now is our institutions. But at the same time, he wants our institutions to work better, right? He doesn't want the mob, members of the mob, to go free, right? He wants there to be actual justice. But obviously, it was a work in progress then, just as it is now.
Yeah. Oh, well, and notably, one of the incidents that Lincoln references in here is an attack on freedom of the press, or attack on the press. Dean, can you talk a little bit more about that incident and how and the reasons why Lincoln would have included that one specifically in his speech?
Well, the most proximate issue confronting him was the murder, the assassination of Elijah Lovejoy, the editor of an abolitionist paper. He had condemned McIntosh's murder, but also slavery in stark terms. And having Lovejoy killed, he was shot in Alton, Illinois, but also having his printing press thrown into the river was a symbol of not only the mob's feelings towards him and his views on slavery, but also what that press represented. And so Lincoln wants to extol the virtues of a free press, of a society that's premised upon different beliefs cohering together, not always in agreement, but certainly adding to democratic discourse. Madison in Federalist 1 argues, he asks a question actually, and the question is whether or not societies of men are really capable of governing themselves, or are they destined to form communities on the basis of force and accident? And Lincoln is really in the Lyceum addressing that question. He's answering it, and he says, well, the only way it can be sustained, the only way that we can have societies of men and women govern themselves is if we're tolerant of one another. And the Madisonian system of institutions, the mechanisms of separation of powers and checks and balances are important. But in addition to what Kate said, Lincoln is also making the case that we have to have an internal set of mechanisms that regulate who we are. And that's where education comes in. Education about democracy, education about what it means to be a good citizen. That too is part and parcel of the mix that's necessary to sustain this kind of government.
So staying on that, and the issue of education being essential for a healthy democracy comes up throughout Lincoln's political career. These ideas that he's expressing in the Lyceum Address how mainstream were they at the time, or were they more radical? Dean, you could start with that, but Kate, I'd love both of your takes on that.
Sure. Well, they're mainstream to the degree that they're not associated with race. I think that's important. The idea that you should obey the law, the idea that you should follow the Constitution. These are not radical in and of themselves. They become radicalized when you begin to touch the third rail of American politics, which has perennially been race. And it's okay to think that we got to follow our institutions and the legal process, except for when these white gamblers who are party to a suspected insurrection are involved, or when Elijah Lovejoy, a troublemaking abolitionist from Princeton's Theological Seminary, returns to the South, and all of a sudden he's supporting abolition, or when a black man, a mulatto, as McIntosh was referred to at the time, kills a constable, a white police officer. Well, all bets are off then. And Lincoln says, no, hold it now. It doesn't matter who the victims are or what their purported crimes were, whoever is accused. The democracy, the republic must hold, and the institutions must hold regardless. And I think that's the critical distinction. I think that's why those links to race are not just something to extol for the sake of our contemporary times. They were important to Lincoln because he understood that that is the canary in the mine, as it were. If we allow this to happen to these kind of marginalized groups, as he suggests in the Lyceum, the rest of us are going to fall down as well.
Kate, anything you'd like to add to that? Or
I mean, Just on the topic of education, and I totally agree, and I think that's one of the reasons why this is a really interesting speech, is because he is drawing attention to the particularly around issues of race and slavery, the inability of kind of a lot of white Americans to even think straight and act right when it comes to those issues. I guess I would also say that the more I researched kind of Illinois in this period, I mean, there are a lot of debates in the United States at that time about how to govern. And one of the things that he's pushing back against is an even more localized vision of governing. So, I mean, as we were talking about before, there's a lot of lawlessness in Illinois at this time period. The state government doesn't even really have the capacity to govern the state, or to have the state militia come in and quell the different kinds of uprisings of violence that happen. But then again, you have on the very local level people who say, well, that's just fine because we super locally want to do things our way in our community and your way in your community. And Lincoln is a person among many lawyers, I would say, like aspiring lawyers. He's in the state legislature at this time. He's very invested in a vision of regularizing how governing works. And I think his vision of education was, we need to spread the word to children. And I mean, he even has a very domestic invocation of education, that it's not just schools, it should be mothers teaching their children from the very beginning of their lives, that like we all should respect our institutions in a kind of more general way. So he's really, I mean, he sounds very modern to us in this speech. It sounds so prescient. There's so many ways that this speech resonates with our own time. But in his time, he was one of many voices talking about the different possible ways to do government and institutions in Illinois and more broadly.
Backing up a little more on why he thought that was necessary, because we did talk about the violence that was happening at that time. But he makes a point in the speech of saying that he thinks the greatest threat is going to come from within the country, not an external threat. And Kate, maybe you can take this one. Why would he not consider foreign powers as great a threat as maybe an internal, or the idea of the country dying by suicide before it's attacked by a foreign power, especially given the relatively recent history in Lincoln's time of the War of 1812, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's again really striking, and I would encourage everyone to just read the speech. I mean, he invokes the Ohio River. He says, like, there's no foreign army or foreign ruler that's ever going to touch their toe in the Ohio River. And kind of, I mean, I think he's invoking a vision of the United States that again feels very contemporary. And like, of course, American history of the 20th century is really defined by the reality that the United States was not in the middle of a place like Europe that was constantly, where people were warring with their neighbors. Like the United States was the dominant power on this side of the globe, and not too worried about invasions from Canada and Mexico and things like that. And that was part of what allowed the United States to become a kind of global superpower in the 20th century. But here he is in the 1837 kind of identifying one of the great strengths, one of the great geopolitical strengths of the United States, what will become one, I should say. I mean, it wasn't even at that point obvious, which is the United States isolation from a lot of the rest of the world. So he's saying, I don't think, and maybe if he were living in Boston, he wouldn't have that same feeling of invulnerability. Maybe it's a pretty Midwestern perspective, but he's kind of saying, I don't see any invading armies from other countries coming in here. I'm not worried about that. We're on a solid footing. But again, and just so interesting how he says the biggest concern is an unscrupulous, highly ambitious person arising who will not be satisfied with just working for someone else, who will not be satisfied with, kind of working within our institutions, but wants glory and wants power and will stop at nothing to get it. And that person will be an American. He's saying that person is not a threat from abroad, that our own country can give rise to that. And that's the greatest threat.
Dean, do you have anything you want to add to that? I mean, certainly foreign powers would have loved to see the American experiment crumble and die under its own weight at that time. And maybe foreign powers would have even meddled, who knows? But I mean, what are your thoughts on this idea that the greatest threat's going to be internal?
Well, it's, Kate has nailed it. She's really expressed it wonderfully. When I think of Lincoln's referencing of Alexander and Caesar and Napoleon in the speech, and then he concludes the speech by mentioning Washington, what's the difference among those individuals? Could Alexander or Napoleon or Caesar cross the Delaware River, not too far from where I'm speaking now? Yeah, I think they could have done that. But what they couldn't have done is what Washington did, step down from power. It's the greatest gift ever given to self-government and a free people. The ability to restrain one's interest in perpetuating their personal power and to step away from it. That is the genius of Washington. That's the genius of our political system. And no Caesar, Napoleon, or Alexander would ever have dreamt of it. The problem for Lincoln is, as he describes it, is that the love of fame, which incidentally Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist talks about fame as a good thing. We need politicians who want to run for office so that they can associate their personal glory with the gifts of the Republic. Okay, that's fine. But what happens when fame becomes associated with and glory becomes associated with tearing down democracy? That's the danger. We don't remember what Washington did, stepping away from power in the same way that those who were alive at that time recall it. Our memories are fading as they have faded. And so we have to re-educate ourselves into democratic life and examples. We need new examples. Our Washington, he says at the end of the speech, to push this through. The association of fame with the preservation of the Republic is what we need now, not the creation of it. And we certainly can't have it associated with the tearing down of the Republic.
Well, and so he does sort of outline how he proposes we would inspire other generations with the examples of the revolution and to understand and know the laws and the Constitution, and to participate in that way too. How practical is it? Is he trying to be practical in this speech by outlining this, or is this meant to be an inspirational speech? How pragmatic are his ideas?
One of the things I agree that he is invoking the founding generation with huge admiration, huge respect, wants to carry forward the legacy of George Washington. But I always think of this speech as being very forward thinking. I mean, he's also saying we can't go back. He's not saying like, let's renew. He's actually saying our generation will never have the same feelings about the revolution as our father's generation did. And so we have to create our own meaning, and we have to create our own visions for how to preserve this country. So rather than trying to keep alive and keep the same meaning of the revolution and have us all keep investing on that, I mean, it's like he wants to remember that, but also, I mean, he turns to the rule of law. I mean, he really says that should be our civil religion. We should all be invested in our political institutions. And that's what's going to get us through. But one of the things that's very Lincoln, very contemporary about it is that it is a forward-thinking speech. It is not like a conservative, a small c conservative speech where he's saying the only good ideas that ever happened were the ideas from the past, and that's what we have to hold on to. He's saying we have no choice but to move forward in history and kind of make our own meaning and make this country sort of survive with the inheritance, the good parts of the inheritance that his generation received, but on their own terms.
In short, acknowledging that upholding the rule of law is not the same as upholding the status quo. Is that fair?
Yeah, and upholding the rule of law is supplemental to admiring the founders, right? So that they sort of gave us this legacy, but then it's our time to move it forward. And yes, that is the small r Republican vision too, right? This is how we preserve the Republic, is to observe the rule of law and take, again, like what we can from the founders, but also move forward.
We're getting close to turning to questions, but question is, how well do you think we've done historically on doing essentially what he outlines or suggests here in subsequent generations? Dean, do you want to take that?
Sure. Well, it's a loaded question, Erin. Thank you for that. It's a softball question. Look, I think the political theorist Sheldon Wolin described democracy as fugitive. There are times when it appears very vibrant and it flourishes, and then there are times where you're looking around for it like it's escaped off somewhere. And I think that's right. There are moments of tremendous democratic movement in our country's history, and then there are moments of retrenchment. We can think about Reconstruction. We could think about the rise of the Klan in the 20s and the Chinese Exclusion Act. And there are countless cases where there's this pas de deux between pro-democracy forces in American life and then those that seek to restrain them. Certainly in recent years, I think we'd have to be living under a rock to say that our democracy hasn't become increasingly vulnerable, perhaps as vulnerable as it's been since the Civil War. And so we've got the Lyceum Address before us as a stark reminder that democracy is vulnerable. Whenever I read the Lyceum speech, I think of a great talk that the writer Charles Baxter gave a few years ago in Vermont, and the title of which was "Things About to Disappear," and he talks about the veils on a woman's hat, or combs that used to hang from ropes in farmhouses. Think today of trying to describe to your kids what a payphone looked like when you were growing up. Maybe not you, Erin, but I can certainly claim that as something I grew up with. But Baxter makes the point, and I think this is Lincoln's point. If you take a snapshot of a given moment, you might see something, but a year or two down the road, you'll be hard-pressed to recall it. And that's true for not just veils on women's hats. It's not just true for payphones, it's true for our democracy. If we're not careful, certain aspects of our political life may well be disappearing before our eyes. And that's at the heart of what Lincoln is getting at.
Kate, do you have anything you want to add to that?
That was a great answer. Maybe we can, I would have some other, things to say, but let's move on because I think, we can get to questions, and that was a wonderful answer.
Great. Excellent. So the first question comes from Michael, who would appreciate your comments on some of the then current and some recent events and how they may have influenced Lincoln's speech. So he mentions, for example, the Panic of 1837, the Nullification Crisis, Nat Turner's Rebellion, and the impact of W.L. Garrison's The Liberator and early signs of manifest destiny. There's a lot in there.
More softball questions. Kate, you.
These are really important national events that provide the context for Lincoln's speech. I think we were touching on the specific incidents of mob violence. So a lot of the speech is about the threat of lawlessness and mob violence. So if you think about, the Nullification Crisis is an example where, although violence undergirds it and the threat of violence is kind of always there, it's a political conflict that plays out through the political institutions of this country. And in a sense, even though it was really messy, that would be more of the kind of conflict that Lincoln would have felt comfortable with. Nat Turner's Rebellion is an example of I wonder how Lincoln would have felt about Nat Turner's Rebellion, right? Because it was obviously an uprising of enslaved people that was also extremely violent and ended up in, the deaths of first a lot of white people and then the Black people who were hanged as a result. And so, that is, there are different moral valences, obviously, when something involves people trying to liberate themselves from freedom or from bondage, as opposed to the kind of mob violence that he's talking about in St. Louis and Alton. So anyway, but I think we can think about this as a somewhat local speech. as well, that the most relevant political events for him that he's talking about are the ones that he's looking at that are kind of in and around the Mississippi River, the center of the country. He has a particular topic in mind that has to do with mob violence and the survival of our political institutions. And so that's where the speech really gets its most kind of oomph and most traction.
Well, and Kate, as you mentioned earlier, the political institutions in Illinois itself were still quite new at that time.
Yeah, correct. I mean, and so also he's an Illinois politician, right? And sometimes in our hagiography of Lincoln, we sometimes forget that he's also doing politics. He's in the state legislature. He cares about votes. He's a Whig. There are Democrats around. He's kind of thinking about, you know, who's running for office and kind of how to get political traction in his own career as well.
The second question comes from Melvin, who asks, would Lincoln have any concerns about democracy in today's America? So that's a what if question, but you can also take that as an opportunity to talk about some of the, you know, specific contrasts that you see between what Lincoln knew. I mean, Lincoln certainly didn't live in an era that was as globalized as we are today, for example, pre-social media and the internet example.
Yeah, well, certainly, you know, January 6th of 2021 would have disheartened Lincoln. That's a polite way of putting it. I think it would have revealed to him, you know, the dangers that ultimately he saw during the Civil War. You know, I think it's important. I mean, we have the hindsight of Lincoln's life and career and you know, many, many years later. But Lincoln lived through the short answer to the question that Madison posed, whether societies of free men can coexist through self-government, or are they going to be subjected to accident and force? And the Civil War was a question resolved by force. The only way to keep the country together was through violence. But then that war ended, and we've had subsequent opportunities to rebuild the country, to have a new birth of freedom, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg. And I think the present politics would suggest that we need another kind of rebirth of American democracy. In his own time, with the country literally rent asunder, he argued for that very premise. It's hard to imagine that he would suggest anything less than that today.
Well, and our next, you referenced this incident, and our next question is actually more specifically about whether you could speak, whether either of the speakers know anyone that can speak to the violence and negativity that led to the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And if you connect the fracturing of our society to incendiary rhetoric and the, you know, authoritarian movements that are happening globally too.
I mean, as we were kind of, this came up earlier in the conversation, but the idea that democracy is difficult, democracies are fragile. There are a lot of forces at work now that, I mean, that weren't in Lincoln's time. One example being, you know, the proliferation of media. Now, as we were talking about with Elijah Lovejoy, I mean, certain media technologies were very much at issue at that time too. The circulation of news media, right? The circulation of newspapers caused pro-slavery people or people who didn't like abolitionists to freak out and make them want to throw printing presses in the river or ban abolitionist literature from coming into the slave state. So here I am just kind of contradicting myself. But so, you know, there's a global issue with the vulnerability of democracies and the rise of right-wing movements that really want to, that are anti-democratic, right? And there are issues that I think are really hard to recognize, in part because to some extent we're so close to them, about the ways that you know, democracies can slide into authoritarian governments. And so it's not just an on-off switch, right? But it's a kind of sense where in some societies you can continue to have elections, but the elections become increasingly meaningless and the power is clustered in unelected officials. And so, you know, we aren't sure, I think, collectively where we are in that spectrum between a kind of real, authentic democracy, because we've always had a very imperfect democracy, right? So where are we on the spectrum between a real but imperfect democracy and some version of a very undemocratic a situation? And so I think, you know, this is this is the moment that we're in. And I think one of the things that people talked about a lot in respect to January 6th or kind of the 2020 election was, to what extent can American institutions bear the level of stress that they are being put under, right? The level, you know, can institutions hold when people are, you know, saying that the election didn't turn out the way that, you know, every court and every count of votes said it did, right? And how, and so I think, you know, this is it's a tough moment to be in. And I think one of the things many people have been talking about is like that we cannot, like Lincoln said, we can't blindly have faith in our institutions or just sort of assume that they're going to work, right? And that it's our responsibility to try to make sure that the institutions of law and of kind of orderly resolution of conflicts work, because they're kind of all we have. We can try to make them better. We might not like how they work very much, but the alternative is a lot more dangerous and is a lot worse.
Yeah, and I won't be able to pull up the statistic, but I remember reading pieces about how just even the participation as a volunteer in a polling place increases the participants' trust in the political institutions, because they are directly engaging in the process and are seeing firsthand how it works and where, you know, how the system is trustworthy in those, you know, types of instances. So yeah, the fourth question asks if Lincoln, this is an interesting one. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, but did Lincoln represent a victim or participant in mob violence? And I assume that Warren means as an attorney. And if so, do you know what arguments he made?
I do not know.
Kate, do you know?
I don't know. Not that I remember having read. I certainly, you know, we know that he represented railroad associated people. We know that he represented some slave owners, right? We know that he had a variety of commercial clients, but I don't know the answer to that.
Warren, we'll try to figure that out and let you know what we find. That's a great question. Question number 5, John would like to say, or would like to know if it's fair to say that, the politicization of courts could also be counterproductive to what Lincoln was emphasizing about the rule of law. So we touched on this a little bit in our discussion about it's not just voting, it's also sort of appointed positions like justices, like, you know, all 3 branches of government matter here. How much was Lincoln really commenting on that aspect of it, I guess?
Yeah, I think, you know, Lincoln was reminding us that institutions are critical, but also institutions are made up of humans. They're made up of individuals, and their perspectives and vision for the country matter. You know, Lincoln famously would take on, Chief Justice Roger Taney in the Dred Scott case and virulently disagree with Taney's view about the American Republic being founded on the white basis. Lincoln thought completely the opposite. But it was an argument intellectually held by Lincoln, one in which, and famously he had his troubles with the court, as we know, as president, but one in which did not lead to his efforts to completely eradicate the court or to, I think, at least in my view of Lincoln and the Constitution, other scholars have written on this, clearly violate the spirit, if not the letter of the Constitution. I think Lincoln did what he could to uphold the Constitution, even in those darkest moments of the Civil War. So back to the point, I think it's, institutions matter, but they're not imaginary, lifeless things. They're human beings that are party to those decisions and in those institutions, and what they think and what their vision is for the country matters a great deal.
We're going to squeeze in one more question from the audience and then a closing question for the two of you. So the last one has to do with, Lincoln was a partisan, a Whig Party organizer, and chose politics as his profession. Did he seek opportunities to work across party lines? Greg is asking specifically about Jacksonian Democrats, but also speaking to the bipartisan process, I guess, would be the question too. Kate, do you want to take this one?
I am not, and this is not super familiar area for me. Is, for example, like Lincoln's political career in Illinois. I mean, Illinois was a very Democratic state. So if you were a Whig in Illinois, you would have to work across party lines. And Lincoln also disagreed with his own party, most famously as a United States congressman when he opposed the Mexican-American War, which many Whigs did, but most Whigs did not. And he, kind of asked very serious questions about getting involved in that war. So Lincoln, I mean, I would say, and then, I mean, if we fast forward to the 1850s and the formation of the Republican Party, you were certainly going to be working with Democrats, because Democrats who left the Democratic Party had to be recruited into the Republican Party. So they were an important part of the Republican coalition. So, without, romanticizing Lincoln's working across the aisle, because he certainly by the late 1850s and 1860s was determined to get Republicans elected to office. But I think, he was also pragmatic in who he was willing to work with.
Mm-hmm. So last question for each of you. What's the biggest takeaway for you for our own times about Lincoln's Lyceum Address? Dean, we'll start with you.
I would just say the false dichotomy or binary of law and order versus racial justice is just that. It's false. Lincoln is telling us we need both to make this democracy work, this large multiracial republic work. We need both. We need a respect and an adherence to the laws, but those laws have to be applied equally. And where racial injustice occurs, we must vehemently denounce it and support those who have been marginalized. I think that's my big takeaway.
Kate, yours?
I think I would say the agency of every generation to protect American democracy and to take care of our institutions. That just as he struggled to figure out how his generation should take on that mantle, that is a thing that we can carry forward and think about what is our moment, what do we need to do to take care of American democracy and political institutions.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. Dr. Saladin Ambar, Dr. Kate Masur, it was a pleasure having you with us tonight. Thanks again. Phyllis, back to you.
All right. Yes, thank you both so much for lending your expertise to the Fortifying Our Democracy project and for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. We're also grateful for our partnership with Iron Mountain and to be able to share this educational project with all of you, our members and donors. Next up, please join us on Wednesday, April 10th at 7 p.m. for part 2. The 1-hour webinar will screen the trailer and the final segment, The Risks of Tyrants, of our short documentary series, Fortifying Our Democracy, Lincoln's Lyceum Address. And that will be followed by a discussion led by Erin Mast with Dr. Angela Ray and Dr. Manisha Sinha, who are featured in the films. Please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org and register for the next session and that follows that. Finally, as you close out tonight's webinar, we thank you in advance for taking just a quick moment to complete a survey. And as always, we thank each of you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all in April. Good night.